Again! Hey everybody! So I'm gonna give just a couple seconds for people to join. I'm particularly nervous today about this one. I don't know. I went kind of down the rabbit hole. Y'all asked for science. We're gonna throw it back to the science of the 60s. It's gonna be a really, I think, interesting conversation because it's been a while since I went back this far in my recollection of what the Apollo and Gemini and Mercury programs were. So today, instead of just talking about the trajectories of a couple of different programs, I actually went back a little bit farther than that. And so today, I'm gonna dive into what the Mercury program was and did, and how we got to the Mercury program, because I think what's really interesting is that it's not like the space program just kind of happened in the late 50s. It was a culmination of a lot of work that came out of war, which is a really common theme in aerospace, right? Like everything we got from planes to rockets, really, and satellites all came out of the military industrial complex. And it's something that the aerospace industry has had to grapple with forever. What's really interesting about it is people like Werner von Braun were actually, he was German and he worked for the Nazis, and he was not exactly a great guy. But he was the sort of main pillar of our aerospace prowess in the 50s and 60s to get to the moon. So I've always found that side of aerospace really interesting, the controversy, the sort of moral compromises people made. And the idea that it's not it just kind of came out of this happy-go-lucky, let's just see if we can fly. It was actually a lot darker than that, which is sort of what has spurred my interest in history and the moral arguments as an engineer, and a lot of that stuff. So very interesting, kind of sad sometimes, but I'm not going to dive too deep into that, but I will dive into some of the history and the science of why the decisions were made the way they were, starting with the Mercury program. So I think we've got enough, maybe a quorum of people joined, so I'll get started. Okay, I'll get started. I don't know why I'm nervous today. Okay, so American space programs. First, we had Mercury. Mercury started in 1958. It ended technically in 1963. But Gemini and Apollo were two programs that were running simultaneously between 1961 for the beginning of both of them. Gemini ended in 66 and Apollo ended technically in 75. So Mercury. The Mercury program had three main goals that they were trying to accomplish. The first was putting a man into orbit. The second was seeing how humans reacted in space. Essentially, we really didn't know. There was a time where we literally thought people would just combust or explode after they crossed the sound barrier, which is Mach 1. And Chuck Yeager did it and was fine. And then it was okay, well, what about Mach 2? And that was a new goal. And so we really didn't know how humans were going to do in space. And then finally, the last one was we wanted to recover both the astronaut and the capsule from space after it splashed down safely in the water. So we had three very high-level goals. They also had some other goals about what it meant to, what kind of systems they wanted on board in the Mercury capsule. I'll talk a little bit about the tension between automation and what these flyboy pilots really wanted. And I'll also kind of talk about what it meant to have some of the health sciences get involved. So we were actually beaten to space by the Soviets and Yuri Gagarin. Today is the anniversary of Gagarin's flight in 1961. I don't know math. Close to 59 years this year. And so I looked at a picture of the capsule that Yuri flew in and was that looks ridiculous. Look up the Vostok 1, VOSTOK 1. And that's when I really started this deep dive rabbit hole search about how did we end up in the shapes of the capsules we did? Because by the time the Mercury program was kind of happening in 1958, like we had ICBMs, which for those of you who don't know what that stands for, it's intercontinental ballistic missile. We knew how to launch things up and have them come down with a bomb on top. And now we were like, just forget the bomb, put a person. And so the rocket was very much a solved problem. Not solved in the sense of like there wasn't anything else to do, like getting a bigger rocket, getting more reliable rockets, being able to lift more payload like I talked about in the last tutorial was still being worked on. But like people knew that they wanted a tube with rockets at the bottom to point up and launch. So I started digging in on like where we got the shape of the capsules, which capsule is the term that we use for the little let's see, here's an example from last time. Like this is what the Dragon capsule or the Orion capsule or Starliner, any of the modern day capsules for humans, they look like this, you know, sort of bullet shape, and they re-enter, so they come back from space with their aft end down. So like, you know, you can imagine this being the aft end coming in back to the atmosphere. And so at this point in the 50s, we were talking about planes that were like barely breaking, well, they were breaking the sound barrier, but we were very new to things coming back from outside the atmosphere. So there was a significant shift happening in the 50s where the NACA, or the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, which was the precursor to NASA, founded in 1915, been around for a while. There's this shift happening on the inside, and a lot of it was classified because it had to do with trying to get better ICBMs. So it all started with a guy named Julian Allen, or his nickname was Harvey. It came from like a Broadway show character at the time, Harvey. Harvey Allen used to work on P-51 Mustangs. I think I saw my dad's on, which is P-51s are like our favorite warbirds from World War II. So this guy was very, very good at his job. But he started challenging from the inside sort of what the future of crewed flight was going to look like when you're coming back from space. And that involves a field called hypersonics. So we'll get back to that, what that term means. But essentially everyone at the time was like, well, we keep making things pointier and it goes faster. So that was what everyone wanted to do. They wanted to make this like super pointy airplane looking thing, put it on top of an ICBM and launch it. Because they were like, that's how you cut through air. That's what you do. Well, the problem is that maybe for a particular flight regime, which is a term for like time of flight and environment of flight, maybe for a particular flight regime, that was going to work really well. That would work for like low atmosphere where the air is a lot thicker and you're trying to cut through and go faster. But what was happening was they were putting these like spiky things in wind tunnels at the Mach regimes or the Mach speeds, which it would experience on reentry, and finding things were just melting. So it was this guy Harvey Allen who really started connecting the dots and essentially was like, we need to make things the opposite of pointy for space reentry, and that opposite of pointy is blunt. And so the word or the term blunt body came to pass. So I want to back up because what's really important is, visual aids. So this guy right here, this is an airfoil. So if you were to cut airplane wing cross section, this is the sort of similar shape. It would look like this. And so this is just representing that you have air that is going to flow over and under the airfoil. And the physics that happens here is what generates lift. And this whole diagram, I could do an entire 30-minute explanation, but I'm gonna just say that like with this air shape or airfoil shape and the air flow, you're gonna get lift, and that's what causes an airplane to be able to fly up. And this was like basic aircraft 101. And this is important because this is very like common Aero 101, but it's only for Mach regimes or flight speeds that are low Mach number. So to review, Mach 1 is the speed of sound. It varies depending on what altitude you're at, but it's a couple hundred miles per hour, multiple hundred miles per hour. Everything below that is subsonic. So sonic is Mach 1, subsonic is slower than that, which is like all commercial airliners, they fly at like Mach 0.7 to 0.8. You have some like private jets that can get up to 0.9. But you're only flying subsonic. You don't break the sound barrier when you fly commercial. That's why these wings, cross sections for commercial planes, look like this. If you break that, now you're going supersonic. So greater than Mach 1 is supersonic. And what ends up happening is you have different needs for airfoils at that flight regime. So this is what an example roughly of a supersonic airfoil looks like. Pointier, basically like a stretched out parallelogram. And these, don't worry about these, I kind of nerded out. I miss my aerodynamic stuff because that's what I did a lot in undergrad, but these are called oblique shocks, and there's a oblique shock at the front and the back of the airfoil, and that's essentially like the air is moving so fast that it bumps into itself, and now you have like a shock wave. And so again, I could do an entire another like lecture on that. And these are called expansion waves. It's essentially just a phenomenon of what happens at the corner here. But this is what like is most efficient at supersonic speeds. So now you have two airfoils where people in the world were like, y'all, if you just keep making things pointier, you can go faster and faster. And for like a certain flight regime, like that is true. And we've gotten really good at sort of computers are able to smooth out some curves. A lot of times like back in the day when we had lower computer power, your models showed that like pointy surfaces were good. We've been able to smooth those out. Again, another whole like lecture on my background in flight test with the Navy. I could go on and on. Point being is this is what you came down to for like planes. This is what we knew. This is all we knew. And when Harvey decided that we needed to start looking into hypersonics, which is like super fast Mach regimes, usually they say about 7 or 10 and above, it was a big question mark. Everyone was like, pointier? I don't know. And it turned out that pointier is not always better. There was a limit to that sort of train of thought. So Harvey sat back and said, okay, well, the rocket is going to throw you up, right? Like the rocket's going to take care of the up. And as long as you maybe have a kind of pointy top, you can get into space, right? Then the reentry question was the bigger one that needed answered. And that's where he said, well, the whole point of reentering is you're going to have to slow down. So let's take that theory that let's slow down and apply it to what causes the most drag. And for those, familiar with the term drag, essentially drag is this idea that like you have thrust, which will take you forward. And as when you go through air, the pressure and the friction from air causes drag. And so it's the force that's pulling you back. So when Harvey sat down and was like, I need to figure out how to slow this thing down, that's where the idea of the blunt body came into account, which is like if you have enough surface area, you can hit the atmosphere or gently ease into the atmosphere as you're lowering from space, and that'll slow you down. He also knew that the reason things were melting in the wind tunnels when they were using super pointy things at the high speeds and Mach regimes that we needed to use and test in, that you were melting everything because the kinetic energy, which is your velocity, the energy from your movement or speed, was translating into heat from friction, and that's why you were melting everything. So this idea of the blunt body, essentially it was like, you can absorb more heat with a blunt face on the bottom of your capsule, use that drag to slow you down, absorb that heat, disperse of the heat efficiently, and that'll slow you down. And you will be able to survive reentry heating. You won't break anyone's neck because you're slowing gently. Actually, this is like a really good, right? Like blunt body is this idea that if you just like put your hand out the window of a car and the air hits it, right? You have like a lot of pressure, but what essentially it's doing is you're traveling at your car at low speeds. Now we're using that same effect to slow you down. Genius. People in the Air Force were like, stop, shut up, that's dumb. That's not what we're here to do. That's never really been the idea, is to slow down. That can't possibly work. And wouldn't you know it, like a couple years later, all of a sudden, all of the bombs on the top of ICBMs had blunt noses. So when they came in the atmosphere, they worked. So Air Force, classic sort of, that can't possibly be right. And then the physics shows that it is, and here we are. So that train of thought wasn't declassified until 1957. Mercury started in 1958. All of a sudden, the paper was released to the public, or just sort of the people who cared about it. A guy actually interviewed Harvey Allen, and his quote is like one of my favorites, because it kind of shows you that like psyche of an engineer or scientist, where he said, "It's all in the physics book. All I did was apply the laws." So sort of this idea that like, you know, the physics hasn't changed, and I just sort of decoded it, which is a really like lovely sentiment that just resonates with me. So blunt bodies, that's what we were all about. That wasn't the end of it though, because at this point it was essentially just thought that was good for ICBMs. So now you have a guy step in named Max Faget. He's French. I like to think that his name was Maximilian. I don't know if it was, but I'm gonna say it was. I think it's, I don't know, French, I don't know. Maximilian. So he looked at Harvey's principles from the ICBM technology and was then like, okay, this is what we're gonna have to do to take it into space flight. So at this time, the X-15 was flying, which is like one of like the pinnacle aircraft of our time. Neil Armstrong was a pilot for it. It essentially, when it came back down, it flew very, very high altitudes. When it came back down, it used its belly to sort of slow down. And so that's where that principle was really first applied. And Maximilian knew it was going to have to be taken to the next level for space flight. So they started doing a lot of wind tunnel tests to say, what is the ideal curvature of that blunt body? So we're not talking flat. When I say blunt, like, I'm not saying it was just a flat plate, which for those of you in aerospace or aerodynamics, flat plate is a very common like test article we used and do the math for to show how drag affects flat surfaces. So I'm talking, when I say blunt body, I mean like a traditional capsule. I mean like sort of a curved, all over curvature. And the idea was they were able to find, I think it was like the radius of curvature, meaning like, the radius of the curvature, you wanted that to be 1.5 times the diameter of the piece itself. I'm very specific math. Wind tunnel tests showed that was a really stable configuration on reentry. So even if you lost guidance, where you had like, you know, little jets of air sort of course correcting you, you were actually able to maintain steadiness. Or if like the pilot passed out, the natural physics of the thing was pretty stable to reenter through the atmosphere like that. And the final factor that really took Maximilian's idea to the next level was that it was a light enough vehicle for its size to launch on top of an ICBM. Because that's essentially what we were doing. We were putting people instead of bombs on top of ICBMs. And so that's what led us to the architecture of the Mercury program and pretty much every capsule since. So, oh, look how cute. Okay, actually, if you guys remember, I drew my favorites here, and this is the Mercury Atlas. This is what John Glenn launched on. This is like a zoomed in picture, and this is the capsule. So you have a single astronaut sitting in the capsule. His back was, he was like laying on his back. This was the sort of, I can't remember what they're called, like cords or, it's important for John Glenn's story. That's unfortunate. Essentially what they're doing, straps, I think there's some heat shield straps. This is what's literally straps that are keeping on the heat shield or helping maintain integrity on the heat shield as you're launching. And then they're released and, sort of this is the only part that comes home. This is like what helped you attach to the rocket. And this is the only part that came home. And so then you sit at the top. So you can kind of see them as zoomed out, zoomed in, whatever, on top of the rocket. And that was it. That was all there was to it. And like the proportions here aren't perfect, but the idea here is that you're on a not that big rocket. Like when I think about, and if you've ever seen the Mercury Atlas or the Mercury Redstone, which was the first two Mercury launches were on Redstones, and the Atlas is bigger, it is it's tiny in comparison to like, a Falcon 9 or, literally name any other operational. It's small. It's really quite terrifying. So this was the idea. This is what we came to. Oddly enough, this is where the sort of like pilot versus automation came into play. Like I said, the vehicle configuration is very stable for entry. The physics of it's great, chef's kiss. But the pilots, being flyboys, they all came from the military where they were all pilots. They actually forced the Mercury Program engineers to go out of their way to make things less automated, to add in manual controls so the pilots could be involved. The Right Stuff, the movie, has a great sort of like tension scene with, they use, I think, Werner von Braun. I'm not sure how directly involved he was or was not with these conversations, but like the engineers are like, you don't need sticks, like control sticks. You can just do it automated. And the pilots were like, I don't want to just sit in a thing, in a tube, in a capsule and go for a joyride. They wanted the authority. Anyway, maybe says a little bit of something about their egos. The Soviets, on the other hand, were like, we don't trust anyone and we're going to automate the shit out of this and you will just sit there. And I actually would be really curious what, I haven't done the research. I don't know what Yuri Gagarin or any other astronaut or cosmonaut with the Soviet Union actually had the capability to do in space. I have no idea. It could have been nothing. It could have just been flying a dead stick, which is like terminology for the stick's not connected to anything. You're not controlling anything. But what's really funny is that the Soviets are really good at automation. They've been automating stuff even up to this generation of actually docking to the International Space Station. And not automation in the way we think of it today. It was a much more time-based thing. We have a lot more intelligent automation today that's like less based on timetables and more based on like the physics of like where are you or some other parameter of measurement that's not just how many seconds has it been since your last maneuver. And so, yeah, oddly enough, the Soviets were really good at automation and our engineers never got the chance because we worked with egotistical pilots who I'm sure were generally lovely anyway, but kind of funny history there. So now we're to the point where Project Mercury has a couple rockets. It has a capsule configuration, and now we're ready to launch people. So the first passenger for the United States was Alan Shepard on May 5th, 1961. So his anniversary is coming up. We missed beating the Soviets for the first man in space by about 3 weeks. Alan Shepard, I think, had a lot of gripes about that. It sounds like based on the order of unmanned or uncrewed, and we actually launched a couple of chimpanzees. We were getting kind of cold feet. We were a little worried about the rocket. I think it was like there was a disaster in November with a rocket. The Redstone literally got 4 inches off the pad and then just blew up. And so they inserted more test flights to the chagrin of Alan Shepard, who then lost the race, not single-handedly, but didn't make it to space before Yuri Gagarin. I think he was still sore about it. So we finally got there, but oddly enough, we didn't actually go into orbit, which is sort of Yuri Gagarin did. Yuri did a single orbit. I think going to space is kind of there's a bit of an argument about it, but the idea is that there's what's called the von Karman line, and it's a certain altitude above the Earth, and if you're above it, you're in space, and if you're below it, you're not. But the atmosphere doesn't just like end, and so it just fades, right, as the air gets less and less dense, and then there's a sort of gray area. So when we went to space with Alan Shepard, he didn't orbit the planet. He got sort of high, and then he kind of came back down. So you guys saw one of my trajectory drawings from last time, but this is one I made specifically with the Redstone rocket that Alan Shepard rode on in mind, and the Mercury capsule. So, I don't know, if I see all these comments, so the comments kind of look like they're in the way for me, Ben Lauer. But the idea here is that we launched from Florida, the rocket went up, the capsule separated, it flipped around, so you can kind of see that it's like now flying butt first. And then when you came down, the after apogee on this parabola, now you're using that blunt body. You're using that blunt end to re-enter the atmosphere. You open a parachute when it's safe, and you splash down. So suborbital. Essentially what they would say is we are launching a suborbital trajectory down the Atlantic missile range, which is like we're launching due east, and you'll get like 100 miles high. I think it was 188 kilometers. Like I said, I'm on a metric only program, so now my whole life is metric. It was about 15 minutes of flying. This whole thing was 15 minutes. It was I don't know. It was funny because the entire point of the program was like, can humans survive in space? And Yuri Gagarin kind of buried the lead on that one for the NASA space program. Clearly he could survive, and so the odds of Alan Shepard dying from like some space-related health illness was very low probabilities now that the Russians or Soviets already proved it. But they actually had Alan Shepard quite wired up. They wrote a 40-page report on 15 minutes of flight about what his body was doing for like the 15 minutes in space. To put it into perspective, we are writing papers all the time based on health data we get from astronauts on the International Space Station, or back when we were on the shuttle program in space for days at a time. I don't know what you could have written for 40 pages other than like his heart rate got fast on re-entry because he was scared. But we learned a lot, apparently. I think a lot of that paper was just confirming, like, yeah, he looked good. Like, this wasn't going to kill him. Which was a huge leap in the health sciences. For anyone who's watched The Right Stuff, which is entirely about the Mercury program, they put these astronauts through the ringer on testing on, how their bodies were healthy enough, sturdy enough, robust enough to go to space. Ben Lauer did make a good point. The Alan Shepard flight, also this is in the movie The Right Stuff. I can't recommend it enough. I feel like I could put that on for 3 hours and I would be dead to the world for 3 hours. It is one of my favorites. Alan Shepard was sitting on the pad for so long, in the rocket, in the capsule, waiting, while they were sort of troubleshooting some of the issues on the vehicle, that he actually had to pee, and he did it in the suit and sat. Oh, it's so gross. He sat in his own urine for, hours, and then the 15-minute flight, and then got rescued and walked on the deck of a Navy, I don't know if it was an aircraft carrier, but a ship. They painted where his first steps were after he hopped off the helicopter, stepping back onto Earth for the first time. And again, he's on his back, right? So like gravity, you weren't just sitting in it. It was up his back. Ugh. No one said spaceflight was glamorous. To this day, the health sciences of spaceflight are still pretty gnarly. But yeah, so this was it. This was an American's first experience in space, was up here. I don't know, somewhere in between up here. And that was it. It was a 15-minute thing. Quite the milestone, though, for the American space program. Now, I'm skipping Gus Grissom, who was the second Mercury astronaut to fly, only because it was the same trajectory. But then we had my boy, John Glenn. He was the first American to orbit. So he had 3 orbits. It was planned actually to be more, but there was a sensor misconfiguration or a sensor issue that they were really worried about his heat shield, and so they brought him back early. But I want to introduce you guys to what ground tracks look like. And so I really apologize to literally every nation on Earth for this map. I did what I could. Still embarrassing. So we first launched out of Florida, and you can see basically the reason that it's this sine wave, which is like the little wave, the shape here of his orbit, is that when you are in orbit around the Earth and you basically just draw a point straight down, which is called your ground track or your present position, you are projecting basically like a shadow onto the Earth of where you are. This is what the path looks like, and what it really means is that you're orbiting the Earth, so you're going around, this way. You're going around the Earth, and when you do that, if you are at an inclination around the Earth, so let's do some orbital mechanics 101. I knew this was going to come in handy. If you are orbiting around the Earth, and it's basically like flat, like you're just in a circle around the equator, your ground track will look like a line on a map. If you have even just a little bit of angle to it, where you're like orbiting like this, my thumbs are in the way so it's hard, then your ground track has a sine wave effect to it. So he launched out of Florida, down and around, and then now he's at an inclination, so he's not just orbiting around the equator, he goes at an angle. So he's above and below the equator, and he did that 3 times. And yes, Rich, there's New Zealand on this map. I didn't leave you off. Having just traveled there and being friends with you, I had to make sure I included it. But anyway, so he orbited 3 times. He splashed down north of South America. You can thank Katherine Johnson of Hidden Figures for calculating that trajectory right there. What an icon, just a legend. And this was it. So this is what John Glenn did, a lot different than the suborbital path. There's something to be said about the complications of like what it takes technically to go to orbit. It generally just means a bigger rocket, more powerful rocket. So that was what the Atlas, which is what John Glenn launched on, was bigger than the Redstone that Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom launched on. And I think everyone after John Glenn too, the rest of the Mercury 7 also used an Atlas. So lovely. Ground tracks, little orbital mechanics in there. And guys, that's the science side, as much of it as I can give today, of the Mercury program. So I did, though, everyone seemed to be very split on whether or not history or science. And so I wanted to take the time. Okay, I'm going to go off script here. Let me take this. Ooh, come here. So I have... I don't know what that is. Very nervous, I guess. I have a lot of memorabilia from essentially the era. That's, well, memorabilia first. This was the flag that my grandmother hung in her classroom when she was a teacher in Ohio. But I have a lot of memorabilia of just the space program in general. And so I wanted to show you guys above my bed. Okay, I'm just going to climb onto my bed. This is a gift, and it's backwards for y'all, I apologize, but this is a gift from Tony Mate, my literature teacher from high school. It is the Columbus Dispatch, shout out 614, of cover of when John Glenn returned from orbit, and it's the next day, I think, or it's the day, wow, it's February 20th, so how could they have printed this? Maybe they printed it, it's the Evening Dispatch. Context clues. This is pictures from when John Glenn went to space, his prep, all of the medical sensors that were added, his suit. That's an infamous picture of when he got, when he got into his capsule, his beautiful Atlas. Oh, there he goes, so cute. Also really interesting, just reading other issue or other news from the day, but there was a lovely Central Ohio boat show that day. But yeah, I mean, what a really cool piece of history that Tony was able to share with me. Super, super indebted to him for that. It's just a lovely little, I don't know. I mean, John Glenn was from Ohio, for those of you guys don't know. And he was a major part of my childhood, so much so that I wanted to share this corner with you guys. Okay, we'll start with this one. In 2002, I wrote a letter to John Glenn because we had a biography project that I did in the 3rd grade, and part of the bonus at the end was if your biography subject was still alive, you could write them a letter. This is what John Glenn replied to me, January 2nd, 2003. My dumbass sent the letter to his childhood home as if he still lived there. It is a museum now. John Glenn did not live in his childhood home in 2003. It got forwarded to his office at Ohio State. Literally, I sent a letter across the state of Ohio only for it to get sent back to Columbus to his office. But it's quite a lovely letter. He, very sweet. The really cool part was he actually included a schedule of the International Space Station of when it was flying over Columbus. He printed it out. He actually printed one out, and then he said on the back, P.S. He went home that evening, found a more updated schedule, told me that it was a lot of evening ones, so I'd have to ask my parents to stay up late. And then look, baby Jill, with my biography project, as John Glenn as a pilot and an astronaut later on the shuttle. I'm adorable. With that, I met him a year later at a premiere of Apollo 13, which he was not in. John Glenn is not a part of the Apollo program. I was very upset that we were watching that movie instead of The Right Stuff or something where he was actually a part of. I was pretty obnoxious about that, but I chased him out of the movie theater and got him to sign. This was the shuttle that he was on when he went to space as a 77-year-old man. And also, Kathy Sullivan, she was running COSI, the Science Center in Columbus at the time. Now she's a dear friend, and we were supposed to get coffee when I was in Ohio a couple weeks ago. and then COVID struck, so we didn't get to catch up with each other, but she's a lovely mentor. And we met, Kathy and John Glenn and I met again at Ohio State at a function on space policy, and I actually got to have dinner with both of them and Annie Glenn, John Glenn's wife. My life has been so weird, so fortunate. And then, there's some other memorabilia things over here. This is a piece of Falcon Heavy from Arabsat, which that anniversary was, yesterday? Yeah, the 11th. My first SpaceX mission I ever saw in person. And then I also have some memorabilia from the Falcon Heavy demo flight. Also, shout out to Gerdeman for some incredible art. I have 2 of his pieces. Well, actually 3 now. That one as well in the end. And so, guys, when I say that my life has been revolving around space, I really mean it. The last thing I wanted to show you guys, I learned a lot of history from this. This is To the Moon. It is a set of 8 records that I play on my record player. And it is essentially like a podcast that was made in 1975 about the beginnings through the end of the Apollo program. So it covers like 1955 or 8, somewhere in there, all the way through 1975. It was a dear gift from a friend. And I've tried to get Caitlin to listen to these and she won't. Caitlin, one of these days. It's incredible. It's essentially live, or not live, it's radio broadcasts from the capsules and mission control itself, interwoven with a narrator, as well as just some really interesting perspectives of history at the time, what those flights meant. Because I think, it's kind of like the pandemic, right? Like what will we remember about this time in 20, 30, 50 years? But seeing what they remember about the programs only years after they happened is it's pretty neat. It's a pretty neat glimpse into history. And then also, this is my flight plan. It's an exact replica of the Apollo 11 flight plan. Really, really special because I now write flight plans at my current employment at SpaceX. My pride and joy, my little prized possessions over here. So for those of you history buffs, you got, a little bit of a sneak peek into just the reason I love all this stuff so much is that it did involve engineers as young as me, now younger, who sent us to the moon. And being able to sort of pay homage to that work means a lot to me. I love being able to share with you guys now something that's so special to me. And so that's the end of today's lecture, guys. I really appreciate you joining me. I'm going to be better about making sure I save this video for other people to watch after it expires in 24 hours on Instagram. I'll be sharing the YouTube link, probably replacing the one that's in my profile now. And you guys can watch this again or share it. And if you guys have any other ideas of any other tutorials you'd like me to give, please fire away. I'm happy to just go through like Gemini and Apollo. There's more modern, I think I talked a little bit about the health sciences today. I think there was a couple people asking for some of the more like international studies implications. That's another great topic that's slightly more modern, but I can dabble in like the Cold War era too. And just reach out whenever. All right. Whew. This was fun, guys. Take care, stay safe, take care of each other, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.